The Rundown with Carrie Saldo podcast is funded by Armbrook Village, offering research-based arts, music, fitness, and lifelong learning programs at their assisted living and Alzheimer's care community in Westfield. armbrookvillage.com.
This is The Rundown, your weekly news and review from Western Mass. I'm Carrie Saldo. Good morning. It's Friday, October 3rd, 2025. And joining me with their take on this week's news from the region, Kevin Moran from the Berkshire Eagle, its executive editor, political consultant Ryan McCollum, and Karen Brown, a reporter here at NEPM. Good morning, everybody.
Good morning.
Good morning.
If you at home have something to say, email therundown@nepm.org. That's therundown@nepm.org. Coming up, working to understand a Legionella outbreak in Pittsfield, Massachusetts. Plus, MCAS test results are still chasing pre-pandemic achievement levels, which weren't exactly exemplary anyway. We're going to discuss all of that later in the show, but first, the government shutdown. Here's how the Washington Post called it. The federal government shut down early Wednesday following an acrimonious deadlock in Congress over spending in which Democrats have sought to put a spotlight on healthcare subsidies and who is eligible to receive coverage. Senate Democrats rejected a Republican-led proposal that would have extended funding at current levels until November 21st, voting nearly along party lines. Democrats had said that they could not support a GOP-led funding extension until Republicans agreed to certain concessions on healthcare policy, primarily the continuation of the pandemic-era Affordable Care Act subsidies that were set to expire at the end of the years. Republicans countered those demands by falsely claiming that Democrats were trying to force the government to provide full healthcare benefits to undocumented immigrants. Ryan, political consultant in the room.
Sure.
Are you optimistic that this shutdown will be short-lived?
Well, any day's too long, right? So I think they'll get to a place where they're going to continue to run the government. You know, this brinksmanship that happens, all too often has happened before. But this time, Trump is like using all avenues to really heap on the blame of the Democrats. And they went to their tried and true message and blamed immigrants, right? And that they know that that's the drum they can keep beating, that people will respond to, even if it's, as you noted, falsely doing so.
Yeah, and the White House, for its part, issued a statement on Thursday with the headline, Democrats shutdown hurts families, veterans, workers across the country, and they're calling this the Democrats' reckless push. So clearly, very, very differing opinions. Some helpful information online from Senator Ed Markey and Richard Neal for people who are nervous about what may be shutting down during this time. Just a couple that Ed Markey's website points out. The U.S. Small Business Administration is going to stop accepting or reviewing new business loans for small businesses. If you do need help there, you can consult the Massachusetts Office of Economic Development. Local Veterans Affairs Benefits regional offices will also be closed, but VA benefits will continue to be processed and delivered. This is according to Ed Markey's website. Kevin, the Eagle's Nate Harrington took a look at some kind of the more hyper-local impacts. He looked at housing. What stood out to you there?
Well, yeah, Nate did take a look at what's going on with the, most immediate impact is that anyone fears is the roof over their head. Mm-hmm. And, while the shutdown is rippling through Washington, the immediate impact on Berkshire County families who rely on, say, housing vouchers and safety net programs is, for the moment, limited. The Department of Housing and Urban Development says that it's continuing to fund housing vouchers like the Housing Choice Voucher Program, at least until mid-November. But after that, all bets are off. The outlook remains uncertain, especially if the budget impasse drags on. Housing advocates told our Nate Harrington that the real concerns, this is really a concern for families, for landlords, and that they're also argue that even without a shutdown, that the level funding that comes for a lot of the housing support that people get around here, the level funding isn't even enough, and that only a quarter of the people who need a housing voucher actually get one.
Karen Brown.
Well, I just think it's interesting and maybe ironic because reducing government services and making the government smaller is actually a major part of the Republican plan right now. So this is a little bit of a preview, where it gives people a chance to understand, here are government services, here's what they do. And so it's a little ironic, I think, that there's, the accusations, well, you're taking away government services now, but actually it's over the Democrats' claims, accurately, I think, that many more government services will be taken away in the long term, like healthcare subsidies is a big one for middle-income people.
The Associated Press pointed out that the U.S. government has now shut down 21 times in the past half century. The most recent shutdown, which stretched 5 weeks from December 2018 into 2019, was during Trump's first term. The Associated Press says, though, that the damage could be worse this time around, quoting, "First, some government agencies dodged the 2018-2019 shutdown because they'd received funding in advance and could just continue operating. That hasn't happened this time. The Congressional Budget Office estimates that about 750,000 federal employees could be temporarily laid off. Trump is also considering something more destructive. His budget office has threatened the mass firing of federal workers, not just putting them on temporary furlough." So potential differences between what we've seen in the past 21 times, as the Associated Press points out. I think we also should point out, though, that this will eventually get resolved and the funding will begin to flow again. But the impact in the meantime, there are federal workers right now, air traffic controllers, others who are working, but they're not getting paid. And that, I think, has real world implications for those folks. So we might not be individually feeling the pinch yet, but there are people who are already feeling this pinch. Any final thoughts before I move us on to our next topic?
Well, I do think that there is some sympathy for, yes, there is a lot of short-term pain here, but there's not a lot of ways for Democrats to fight against what the Republican agenda is right now, as far as, again, especially healthcare cuts, but a lot of different things. And this is one of the few ways, and I've heard a lot of people saying, well, this is something that has to happen.
Yeah, I think importantly, like you mentioned, the first shutdown or the last shutdown was under Trump. That was a Trump with at least a little bit of guardrails. What Trump 2.0 has been guardrail-less. And to Karen's point, it's a preview. If they can, they don't like government, plain and simple. And so, using this to kickstart and continue, like with Doge and these places were already struggling, and now this shutdown, it makes it worse, and I don't think it will get back to where it needs to be when the funding starts coming back.
And I could hear somebody from the Trump administration saying, well, this is needed, government has gotten too big, and this is one of our ways we're pushing back. Well, the Senate is scheduled to hold another vote today on a short-term funding measure, so obviously to be continued here. Going to move us on to reporting out of the Berkshire. It's been over the last several weeks tracing a Legionella bacteria outbreak in the city of Pittsfield, reporting by Greg Sukenik. This information became public in mid-September, Kevin. Berkshire Health Systems reported 7 patients tested positive for the bacteria that causes Legionnaire's disease. I'm quoting Greg here. One of the patients later died, although because of their existing comorbidities, it's not possible to know whether their death was the result of their infection, officials said. Not all 7 patients with positive test results were admitted for treatment. Kevin, tell us a bit more about Legionella, which then causes Legionnaire's disease, and how it's contracted.
Well, simply, Legionella is a bacteria that's found in water systems, and if that gets into you, it can cause Legionnaire's disease, which is essentially a severe form of pneumonia. It's not spread from person-to-person contact. You can't give it to another person if you have it, but when people inhale mist or water vapor containing the bacteria, then they can, become sick with it.
So maybe it comes out of your shower head or your air conditioning system.
Absolutely, you
central
could
air. More
drink
commonly.
some of that water or something like that. It's not fatal for in most cases, but some of the symptoms do resemble something like flu. High fever, muscle aches, cough, headache, loss of appetite. And public health experts, say that as many as 90% of the people who actually have Legionella, those cases go undiagnosed because
that was crazy to me.
Yeah. So there's a lot there, and of course, Legionnaire's disease is first came to our attention, at least I think nationally, around 1976 when there was the big convention down in Philadelphia where 200 American Legion members of the American Legion contracted what was
They
then
must be
this.
so bummed that now their name is forever connected
Yeah,
to this disease.
I'm sure I didn't name the disease or that type of thing, but I think that was I think that's what probably feels like a scary part about it. For sure.
In the past 4 months, Berkshire Medical System Laboratory has reported 7 positive patient tests for the bacteria. The last known positive test that Greg reported was on August 22nd. Now the timeline here. So we've got 7 cases in the past 4 months prior to the lead up to August 22nd, but cases were reported to the public about a month later in mid-September. So do we know yet about when the Department of Public Health was informed and whether that's a typical timeline?
Well, BMC says it was consulting throughout the summer with the Department of Public Health and letting the city know. The Department of Public Health, which monitors such thing as diseases in our communities, they're automatically supposed to be notified under state rules when Legionella is detected in a water supply. The timeline depends, on how close together the cases occur, the quality of patient information, whether clear links between cases can be established. Most cases are considered sporadic, meaning that no public notice is issued unless multiple connected cases are confirmed. But, by the time they had conversations in September, which is, 67 days or so after the first contact, they decided, well, we got to get the word out. It seems like a long time, and we're trying to poke at that a little bit more and get a better idea exactly what the timeline is. And I expect some more reporting from Greg to be forthcoming in the next few days.
Karen Brown?
Well, just as a health reporter, I think it's important also to look at the effects of cuts with the CDC and public health and federal oversight in general. So aside from this specific case, these are the kinds of cases that I fear we're going to see more of if there is less federal oversight of healthcare and other kinds of instances like this.
And there was state oversight in particular on this one. What steps have Berkshire Medical Center or Berkshire Health Systems kind of taken to assure water safety? Because I'm sure patients and people who have interactions with the hospital are curious or nervous.
Yeah, and let's keep in mind that it seems to be in some water, around the hospital, but the water comes from the city of Pittsfield. So the city of Pittsfield is super chlorinating its water supply. They're testing it, and they have to have several consecutive tests that show a clean bill of health for the water system. And then they're also, replacing filters in items like air conditioners, showers, ice machines, things like that. And so the precautions will continue until they get the clean bill of health.
You mentioned there's probably forthcoming reporting from the Eagle. Do you want to tip us off to maybe a question or two that the Eagle has lingering that you're interested in getting answers to?
Yeah, again, it's going to be, I think, really sort of probing between the time of, okay, you knew there was an issue here with some Legionella, and, then 60 plus days later, the public sort of gets word about it. And so I think, trying to sort of assuage public concern around that particular issue is really, I guess, what we're ultimately just trying to clarify, and making sure, of course, that, the proper protocols were followed when it comes to public notification.
And Mike Leary, a spokesperson for the health systems, has said that they were in consultation with the Department of Public Health and worked together with the Department of Public Health to determine when and how to inform the public.
It's a bit
about
of a PR.
this.
It's a bit of a PR conundrum, because is it better for them to be upfront, but then people know that there's a disease, or to get the reputation of hiding something? So
What came first, the water droplet or the tap? All right. We are going to take a quick break here on the rundown. Coming up, the latest MCAS test scores show that some of the biggest school districts in Western Mass are lagging behind state expectations. And a Berkshire Eagle editorial weighs in on how to lower the temperature in a politically tense time. What does our panel think? We'll find out. You're listening to the rundown here on 88.5 NEPM. Stay with us. Welcome back to the rundown here on 88.5 NEPM. Keeping the conversation going. I love it. We are here in studio with Kevin Moran and Karen Brown, journalist and political consultant Ryan McCollum. Well, among this week's news, MCAS scores are still not back to pre-pandemic levels. Reporting by May Munford, the Springfield Republican, quoting here, the 2025 Massachusetts Comprehensive Assessment System, MCAS, results show that students across the state are still trailing pre-pandemic achievement levels, the State Department of Elementary and Secondary Education announced on Monday. I took a look at some of these DESE stats in 4 different districts, kind of targeting the 4 Western Mass counties. 3 of the 4 of those districts scored far below the current goals that the state has for, quote, meeting or exceeding state standards. And even worse, when you look at the pre-pandemic 2019 scores, the state pre-pandemic scores had English and English at 61% meeting or exceeding expectations, math 59%. Now, statewide, we're looking at 51% in English and 45% in math, and that's among 10th graders. DESE officials said in a statement that the results underscore the need to address chronic absenteeism and improve early literacy, which are 2 priorities of Governor Healy. Kevin, the Pittsfield was one of those districts with scores below the state. What do you make of these latest figures on student academic performance?
Well, let's keep in mind that we went through several years of lockdown, and I really think that displacement there, while it was probably a good idea for public health, did have an impact on child education. And we're beginning to, I think, see some of the, the scoring fallout from that. Pittsfield, it's been, we've seen some slight improvement in some schools overall in Pittsfield. We've seen some not improvement in other parts of schools. Throughout the county, a few schools have also improved, and a few other schools, are still maintaining sort of the status quo. So it is a mixed bag, but it's definitely something that to be concerned of.
NEPM's Jill Kaufman spoke with Education Secretary Patrick Tutwiler, and he said that no state, including Massachusetts, have test scores that have fully bounced back from the pandemic. Let's hear what else he had to say.
No subgroup by race or by socioeconomic status, students with disabilities, those without, no demographic is back to pre-pandemic levels of performance.
That's interesting for me to hear from him because I think pre-pandemic, we were often looking very carefully at those subgroups to make sure that all students, whether they were on a certain education plan to help them catch up with other students or not, were being kind of kept pace with what the state expectations were. Ryan, what are you thinking as you look at this?
Well, the first thing I think about is where do they come up with their expectations? I mean, so if everybody's not meeting expectations, then maybe your expectations were too high. And so how did you come up with those expectations to begin with? I want to give a little flowers to Libertas and Springfield. They've got to, they're ones that got really high, and it's a charter school, and it shows about how interventions are different in a charter school and how they use testing differently and how the state still uses MCAS to make sure your charter's in good standing. So they still have that kind of MCAS importance that the high schools don't anymore, right? So after that ballot initiative, it's no longer a graduation requirement.
Right. We saw voters turn out last November and say, we do not need this to graduate. The tests are still going to be used for assessment and performance, but it's no longer a graduation requirement. Karen, what's on your mind?
Well, I just think it's also important, as always, to look at socioeconomics and drill down sort of school by school, district by district to see which ones have the most and least resources. And my guess is that those who were struggling beforehand with lower resources, lower incomes, are probably having a harder time to catch up. And I just think inequality among districts should always be looked at.
And that might bear out in some of the numbers, because if we look at Amherst and Northampton, they're well above what the state expectations are for the scoring, both
Right, and
in
when
the
you have
10th grade
these-
levels and the 3rd through 8th levels.
So when you have these kinds of inequalities, the differences just get bigger and bigger.
Yeah,
so that's the problem.
disproportionately.
Yeah.
Yeah, and also looks at like during the pandemic and during lockdown, those with the privilege to be read to more, to that have internet access, who they're not going to lag behind as much as the folks
that's
who
a really good
don't have
point.
any of that stuff. So.
I also found this fascinating, if not troubling, wrinkle. There was a July 2024 report from the Annenberg Institute that looked at MCAS as a graduation requirement, and this was in the run-up to the ballot question. Quote, since 2011, the share of students earning an A or a B has increased substantially in all core academic subjects, but inflation appears to have accelerated during the pandemic, when grades went up markedly, while test scores and attendance both declined sharply. I don't exactly know how to square those two things, but as a parent looking at it, it's nerve-wracking for me, because if the grades that my teacher is giving my kid don't line up with the test scores that we're seeing, what are we supposed to take from that? Where are these students?
Well, my
actually
guess is
landing?
they were also looking at mental health. Mental health was such a big problem during the pandemic, and I guess that was an attempt for kids not to feel terrible about their progress or what they were doing. But
Or they were grading on a curve a little bit.
Yeah.
You know what I
for a
mean?
lot,
Like an
yeah.
artificial curve, and like, all right, these kids are getting A's, and maybe kids caught up to each other more, but didn't necessarily catch up to the test scores.
Well, something we'll definitely continue to track here. Moving on to an opinion piece in the Berkshire Eagle this week, the headline, "An increasingly vengeful America should follow Erica Kirk's example." Quoting, at the memorial service September 21st, for her slain husband, Erica Kirk did something that seems superhuman in an America beset by amoral vindictiveness and grievance mongering. She forgave. As Miss Kirk dug deep into a wounded heart to find forgiveness for the young man accused of rending her family, she articulated the ethic we must now hold. Quote, the answer to hate is not hate. While it's unrealistic to expect everyone to meet the saintly standard of compassion Miss Kirk demonstrated, it must be understood that the content of her message is not a call to ignore injustice and dismiss wrongdoing. Rather, if we want a more just society, we must always remember, even and especially when we hurt the most, that justice and vengeance are never synonyms. Kevin, do you know what inspired this editorial at the Eagle?
Well, the Eagle editorial board does get the chance to meet on a weekly basis, and we talk about a lot of local ideas, a lot of regional ideas, a lot of national ideas, and increasingly we're finding ourselves drawn, although we are focused on being a local, really intensely, relentlessly local newspaper. We have taken about an editorial a week and focused on a national topic that, for all intents and purposes is local. Being a good citizen.
Absolutely.
Forgiveness is something that I think all citizens aspire to. I do have to give a hat tip to our editorial page editor Dave Coffey, who I believe is a native of West Springfield, Mass, because he writes our editorials, composing what he can out of our thinking and out of our thoughts. He assembles something coherent, and he's done that quite finely here, and he really deserves a lot of the credit and a lot of the insight for really crystallizing the thoughts that you just read.
Ryan, a new NBS PBS Marist poll caught my attention. And on Thursday, it asked about, it was released on Thursday, but the poll asked about 1,300 adults about political violence, specifically whether they agree or disagree with the following statement. Americans may have to resort to violence in order to get the country back on track. The results, a strong majority, 70% disagree with that statement, but the 30% who now say violence may be necessary is up 11 points since April. Driven by Democrats, and 18 months ago it was 12%, and 31% of Republicans polled also say Americans may have to resort to violence. That's up 3 points from last year. That's reporting from NPR's Domenico Montanaro. What does this heavy thinking.
Again, like when we're talking about what the MCAS, what they should be at, what does back on track mean? So putting the country back on track for Democrats is very different in the average Democrat putting it back on track for Republicans. And so, seeing what's going on and seeing the political violence, obviously 70% are against political violence, but the Democrats have seen what's going on with President Trump having troops in the cities, ignoring the Constitution, doing, some things that were like, all right, what's the last resort? And I think some folks are thinking about that. Meanwhile, President Trump is doing those things, and there's Republicans who are saying, we need to do those things. We need to hit hard when it comes to immigration, and we need to use the violence to get the country back on track. Their back on track might be the 1930s. Our back on track might be, Obama time, right? So that's the difference.
Karen, for you were at a protest not that long ago, and we spoke at length about it last week here on the show. Largely, people were protesting their concerns related to free speech being under attack. Did anybody mention political violence? Was that on anyone's mind?
A lot of people mentioned gun violence and the need to rein back the availability of guns, and they pointed out sort of the irony that Republicans, of course, want there be fewer restrictions with guns, and guns is how Charlie Kirk died. So there was some of that conversation.
Yeah. Bringing us back to the Eagle editorial, quote, "The reality, though, is that lowering the temperature from this unsustainable boiling point is a responsibility that falls to all of us, leaders and everyday citizens alike. We don't have all the answers as to exactly what America must do to escape this slippery slope, but we do know what the answer can't be. And so Erica Kirk's wisdom is worth repeating. The answer to hate is not hate."
Yeah. And I think, there's some ironies. I think that it's a really well-written editorial, and Erica Kirk's part was great. But later on stage, there was hate. Later on that same exact stage where she's standing, there was hate coming from Stephen Miller, and he was actually pulling from a Nazi Germany speech by Goebbels. And the irony of her, that speech sounded like Martin Luther King, right? It sounded like turn the other cheek, nonviolence. But ironically, her husband said bad things about Martin Luther King. So there's a lot of irony, and I think both sides are still kind of emotional about it. And hypocrisy is what both sides don't like. But her speech was great, and if we can center it like they did at the Eagle and put that up on the pedestal, and this is what we want to look for, makes a lot of sense.
Certainly a time to be, I think, thinking about how we can each kind of lower the temperature and maybe take a beat and figure out what we think before something comes flying out of our mouth, which is not incredibly popular in an age of easy scrolling on our phones and a 24-hour news cycle, which feels like
now.
3 days packed into one.
Yep.
AI. It's a challenging time, but I think it's beholden to us, all of us to give it a shot. All right, I'm going to move us on to our scoop, praise, and prediction part of the show, where we talk about maybe a piece of reporting that's coming up, heap some praise on some news we've seen, or make a prediction about something that we've seen in the news. Karen Brown, for you, scoop, praise, prediction, what's on your mind?
Well, one thing I've been working on that will be a part of a sort of a statewide collaborative that our newsroom is doing is on vaccines, childhood vaccines. So not COVID vaccines, but measles and mumps and
routine vaccinations for
polio,
kids?
that kind of stuff. And drilling down, Massachusetts does very well, but individual schools, especially out in Western Mass, have some really shocking rates, like down to the 20%. It should be 95% for herd immunity. Some places are 50%, 68%, and a lot of places are simply under herd immunity. So I'm looking into what that means, why that might be, and what can be done about it.
Fascinating. Looking forward to that. Ryan McCollum, what's on your mind?
Little praise from and I helped with this campaign, but in the town of Longmeadow where I live, we voted for an override on this past Tuesday for a brand new middle school, and those things are tough, right? And it was expensive, expensive bond that we went out for, but it was seen to prioritize education and to see voters also who are not parents to step up and say this is the right thing.
We talked about that at length a couple of shows ago, so if you're interested, check out our archive, nepm.org/the rundown. I've got quick praise this week. The New England Newspaper and Press Association Awards were announced. The Eagle, for the 8th year running, is once again Newspaper of the Year.
Yay.
Kevin Moran, congratulations. Springfield Republican took second place, and NEPM, a joint report by the Republican and NEPM, won for civil asset forfeiture. And I have a lot of gratitude for the fact that we have this type of news coverage in our region. You are listening to The Rundown. My thanks to the panel. Get out there and have a great Friday, everybody.